Hey guys. So here we are with chapter 3. I'm actually re-recording this because of a snafu with my prior recording. Um, so I'll get this up today without delay. So early chordates and jawless fish. Let's dive in. Um, I think it's interesting to start with the fact that there are a lot of uncertainties around vertebrate evolution. And as you read these chapters in your book, it definitely emphasizes that fact. So a lot of biologists have had a hard time understanding evolution at the geologic scale, while paleontologists have a difficult time understanding evolution at a biological scale or a more recent time history scale. And one of the reasons for that confusion and uncertainty is that we have so few records in that intermediate scale of hundreds of thousands of years that allow us to relate evolution at these two scales and really connect them. So, paleontologists have long suspected that vertebrates diverged from lancelet like relatives sometime in the Cambrian, about 545 million years ago. But molecular studies of gene similarities between lancelets and today's vertebrates suggest that vertebrates lineage may go all the way back to 750 million years ago. And there are a few clues that come up again and again that biologists and paleontologists look for when they're searching for evidence of vertebrate ancestors in the fossil record and also in embryonic development. And just to pause there, it's really interesting to think of embryonic development as the unfolding of our evolutionary history and how we look for clues just through the course of those earliest stages of development that tell us about where we came from. So one of the clues that we look for is the neural crest. The neural tube is actually a sheet of cells that curl up like a tube on the exterior of an early primitive vertebrate. Along the edges of that sheet, a special collection of cells called the neural crest break away and wander around the embryo and help to shape a lot of the structures around the head region. So that includes the eyes, the nose, head muscles, skull bones. So although lancelets don't have a neural crest, they have something that resembles that, but all other vertebrates do. Mineralized bone is another clue that we look for. Only vertebrates have mineralized bone. So when we see evidence of that, even moderate calcification of the bone, that gives us some clues about whether or not an organism is a true vertebrate. So again, chordate ancestors, lots of question marks around that. There's no living proto-chordate that's thought to be ancestral to vertebrates. Evidence from gene sequencing suggests that tunicates represent the closest living relative of vertebrates. Several other groups have possible ancestral ties and have been proposed, and lots of different theories have been proposed as to which organisms are ancestral, including those that have just been identified in the fossil record. So the cradle of vertebrate evolution was really limited to a zone of shallow coastal waters, only about 30 meters deep, where fish appeared about 480 million years ago. So for about 100 million years, those early fish rarely strayed from that fairly limited habitat. But there was a lot of evolution and diversification that happened in a relatively limited area over that relatively long expanse of time. So as I said, there continues to be a lot of spirited debate about evolution, and this figure on the lower right sort of shows a few different theories of thought in a cladogram. Loved your cladograms as to the relatedness amongst some of these major groups of organisms. I liked this figure from the book as well. So the evolution of the major groups of hagfish and lamprey and fishes and their relationship to each other and to amphibians and amniotes are shown in this figure. What's interesting when you look at this figure is that the lines indicate the relative number of species, and where they widen in regions, that shows periods of adaptive radiation in those groups of organisms. And then where they narrow is when we see bottlenecks or loss of some of those species. So if you look at sharks and rays, you can see they radiated during the Carboniferous period. They came close to extinction during the Permian period and then recovered in the Mesozoic era. And as you can see, modern bony fish currently make up most of our living fish and have been through a large period of radiation. So we're going to talk about lamprey and hagfish kind of through the rest of this lecture. Hagfish have fascinating animals, and my kids have been hearing a lot about them in the last few days because I've been prepping for this lecture and reading up and watching some hagfish videos at home here. So the earliest hagfish fossils come from about 330 million years ago. We know that hagfish are strictly marine. They live in burrows at the bottom of the ocean in waters cooler than 72 degrees Fahrenheit. They are cosmopolitan, that's a term for worldwide, and have an ecological role in the marine system. They serve as prey for many marine animals, including codfish and dogfish, sharks, octopus, cormorants, harbor porpoises, harbor seals, some species of dolphin. And when you look at their evolution, what you see is that there's been very little change over the last 500 million years or so. So they are considered the most primitive living craniates out there. And I've got a video link here of a hagfish demonstrating its nodding behavior, which I'll hear a little bit more about in a moment. And lamprey. So lamprey are some of the earliest fossils out there. Gosh, they date back to about 360 million years ago, and they can be found in both marine and freshwater habitats. Lamprey morphology, again, like the hagfish, has really been stable for a very long time. So again, a very primitive species, about 360 million years of not much change. And the fossils do differ very little from modern forms of this organism. We're going to talk through jawless fish morphology here, and a lot of this does focus in on the lamprey, but is generalized for both of these groups of species. So skin of these organisms consists of a thin epidermis of living cells and a more complex dermis. Mucus covers the outside of the body, and actually the hagfish have a series of pores that allow for sort of an excess emission of mucus when they need that as a defense mechanism. So they can coat themselves with this mucus, which coats the gills of predatory fish and either could suffocate them or cause them to give up on trying to attack a hagfish. And when they have excreted a lot of this mucus, one of the mechanisms that they use to rid themselves of it is that knotting behavior. And so they can use their sucker mouth to attach to something, or do it while they're free floating, tie a knot in their body and move the knot down towards the tail, pushing that mucus away from the body. And see them use that same behavior when they are looking for leverage and they're attached to what they're feeding upon. The skeletal system, the skull is a little more than a trough-like plate of cartilage in which the brain rests. And there's a basket framework of cartilage under the skin that surrounds the gill slits. The jawless fish lack a vertebral column, but they have cartilaginous segments on top of the notochord that are sort of the first evolutionary rudiments of a true backbone. Cardiovascular system. The heart of hagfish and lamprey is located in the pericardial cavity, and the heart consists of several parts, including the sinus venous, the atrium, the ventricle, and the conus arteriosus. So several of the same parts that we see in other vertebrate hearts. And then we actually in hagfish see 3 additional sets of accessory hearts to help move blood down that long kind of linear body. Respiratory system is very passive. Water enters through nostrils, passes through the pharynx, from the pharynx through gill pouches. In parasitic lamprey, they have adapted for a sort of bi-directional flow of water through the gills for when their sucker mouth pharynx is occupied and attached, sucking body fluids. Digestive system, lamprey have that round suctorial mouth inside what we call the buccal funnel. And within that funnel is a thick, fleshy tongue with horny teeth on it, used for scraping the fish and actually boring into their prey. When lamprey attach to their host, they use that tongue to create a wound and actually secrete an anticoagulant, which is a similar strategy that we see in leeches. So really sort of similar to a large leech, that anticoagulant keeps the blood from being able to clot and allows for ready flow of blood and body fluids for the lamprey to feed upon. So although lamprey don't often directly kill their host, they leave a wounded and weakened animal and are responsible for quite a few fish deaths out there. Food passes straight into a simple digestive system. They have a folded intestines. Jawless fish do not have a true stomach, and they also lack a swim bladder, which you hear a lot more about in chapter 4. Hagfish are usually scavengers. They lack an oral disc. They have a feeding apparatus that consists of 2 dental plates hinged at the midline, and they feed primarily on small, soft-bodied living invertebrates, but also on dead and dying fish. And then finally, the nervous system of jawless fish consists of inconspicuous cerebral hemisphere and rather prominent olfactory bulbs, which we see in the more evolved fish as well. Hagfish really lack other sensory organs. Lamprey are the only jawless fish with a lateral line system, and we'll talk more about lateral line systems in chapter 4, but it's a really fascinating sense that fish have developed that's used to detect even small vibration or movement or changes of pressure around the fish. So it's a system of hair cells that detect and transmit movement. So we see that in adult lamprey. Adult lamprey also have a set of lateral eyes that serve as receptors of light. And it's worth noting that the larval lamprey lack eyes during that stage. And that stage of development can last quite long. So urogenital system, and we'll talk through reproduction and growth and development as well. Hagfish maintain body fluids with a salt concentration actually similar to that of seawater. And that is referred to as being isotonic. All other marine vertebrates maintain salt concentrations really at a fraction of the level of seawater, which is known as being hypotonic. So that's an interesting adaptation that we see in hagfish, that they don't have to deal with getting rid of excess salt in their marine habitat. In order to maintain a hypotonic condition for all those other saltwater organisms, the fish rely on their urogenital system really to reabsorb water and bring their system back into that hypotonic state. And they also have specialized salt excreting cells in the gills that help them rid themselves of extra salt that they've absorbed in their gut. Both hagfish and lamprey possess only a single gonad. There's no ovary duct or sperm ducts or eggs. Eggs and sperm are actually released directly into the abdominal cavity and pass into the cloaca through the abdominal pore. And really, very little is known about hagfish reproduction. There's no information about where reproduction occurs or how the eggs are fertilized. We do know that females tend to lay between 20 and 30 large yolky eggs that have a hooked filament, and your book has a picture showing how those eggs hook together and also can attach themselves to the substrate at the bottom of the marine environment of the ocean. Lamprey adults can live in salt water or in freshwater, but all species spawn in freshwater. So that indicates that this group actually evolved in a freshwater system and then secondarily invaded the saltwater environment. Female parasitic lamprey are prolific. They can deposit as many as 260,000 eggs, while most non-predatory females will only produce a couple of thousand. Lamprey often create brooding areas for their eggs in kind of shallow gravel bottom streams that can be impacted negatively by sedimentation and runoff into water. So that appropriate gravel bottoms are a subject of conservation concern for lamprey and for other fisheries. When we refer to those areas as redds, the nesting habitat for some of these spawning freshwater fish. So young hagfish hatch as small, fully formed hagfish. They don't go through a larval stage. But again, a lot of the details of their life history, such as how old they are at their first reproduction, what their breeding sites look like, what juvenile habitat looks like, are all unknown. And I find that there's some irony there that our oldest vertebrates are the least understood. Lamprey do undergo a larval stage, and quite a long one for some of the species. They have blind, toothless larvae that float away from those nesting areas with maybe faster moving currents and water that allow for that gravel bottom into stiller waters with more muddy bottom, and they burrow into those muddy areas as blind, toothless organisms, almost resemble worms. And they can remain in that stage for 3 to 7 years as filter feeders. And once they move into the adult stage, it can last from 5 to 6 months up to 2 years. And there are actually some lamprey that don't even feed at all in that adult stage, but all lamprey die after spawning once. And I have a couple of links here. I hope you guys will take some time to watch these videos. It's really interesting that lamprey are both the subject and source of conservation concern. The Pacific lamprey in Washington State is one that biologists have focused on for quite a while. And there's a growing understanding of the habitat requirements for these organisms, the threats to the Pacific lamprey, and their importance to tribal groups from that area. So they even, I think in that video, show just this fascinating adult behavior that we see in lamprey of how they are capable of moving upstream to their spawning areas, which includes moving over fish passages and waterfalls by using their sucker mouth to climb. So it's really cool to watch. The other video and sort of lamprey story that's also included in the book is the story of the lamprey invasion into the Great Lakes, which just is an equally fascinating story. Sea lamprey were really blocked from moving into the Great Lakes by the Niagara Falls and the Niagara River, which I suppose the Niagara Falls was a little too large for them to climb with their sucker mouth. And in order to increase accessibility to boats, in 1921, the Welland Canal created a connection between the ocean and the Great Lakes and allowed for lamprey to move into that area. And they just started decimating fish populations in the Great Lakes. At one point, it was estimated that lamprey were killing close to 100 million pounds of fish each year, which had once been part of just a thriving fishery. So major interventions over the decades have included capturing males and sterilizing them, killing females. They created a lampricide that targets larval lamprey and kills them. And so through some very active management, they've reduced those lamprey populations by 90 to 95% at this point. Even recently, they figured out that adult lamprey use cues from larvae, the bile that larvae secrete, that helps guide them to their spawning areas, and researchers are using that information against these invasive lamprey. And that's it for chapter 3. As with other chapters, I picked out a few interesting questions for you guys to look through and maybe use to review chapter 3. All right, talk soon.